Rome perfected the art of public suffering, and many of the people it brutalized most viciously are the same figures you find at the heart of the Bible. So in this video, we are going to walk through every known torture method that Rome inflicted on biblical figures, what each method actually involved, why Rome used it, and what it did to the human body. Because understanding what these people endured changes the way you read their stories forever. To understand any of this, you first have to understand how Rome operated. Rome did not maintain an empire through diplomacy alone. It maintained it through fear. Every province, every occupied city, every conquered people understood one thing clearly: defy Rome and you will suffer. But you will not suffer quietly, you will suffer publicly, visibly, in ways specifically designed to make everyone watching think twice before they ever resist. Torture was not just punishment, it was propaganda. A spectacle broadcast across the empire through broken bodies left on display for all to see. And the people in the Bible who challenged the powers of their time received that message in the most personal way imaginable. So, let us begin with what may be the most well-known suffering in all of human history. Before Jesus was ever nailed to a cross, he was scourged. And Roman scourging was not a simple whipping. It was one of the most brutal preludes to execution ever devised. The tool was called a flagrum, sometimes called a flagellum. It was a short handle made of wood with 2 or 3 leather thongs extending from its base. But the leather alone was not what made it devastating. Tied into those straps were small pieces of bone, metal balls, or sharp fragments of sheep bone called knuckle bones. Some versions used small lead weights called plumbati. The design philosophy was straightforward. Every strike would not only cut the surface of the skin, but dig deep into the muscle underneath and rip chunks of tissue away on the backstroke. The victim was stripped naked and tied to a wooden post with their arms above them or stretched forward so the entire back was fully exposed. Roman soldiers would then take turns, striking the victim across the back, shoulders, buttocks, and upper legs. Jewish law capped flogging at 40 lashes, and the Pharisees typically limited it to 39 to avoid accidentally exceeding the count. But Rome had no such restriction. Roman scourging had no formal limit. The soldiers could continue until they were told to stop, until the commanding officer was satisfied, or until the victim lost consciousness. The physical result was catastrophic. The first several blows would tear through the outer layers of skin, but as the beating continued, the flagrum would begin ripping into the subcutaneous tissue beneath. The muscles of the back would be exposed. Blood vessels would shred open. Historical accounts describe how in severe cases, the scourging went so deep that the ribcage became visible through the pulverized flesh. The early church historian Eusebius recorded cases where prisoners died under the flagrum before they could ever be taken to their execution. He wrote that the veins and muscles and even the intestines of the victims were laid bare. Some writers described the body after scourging as an unrecognizable mass of torn and bleeding tissue. Roman physicians actually had a term for the state a person reached after a severe scourging. They called it halfway to death, and that was precisely the point. The scourging was not meant to kill. It was meant to bring the victim as close to death as possible without crossing the line, because Rome had something worse waiting. So when the Gospels tell us that Pilate had Jesus scourged, that single word carries the weight of an experience so violent that it alone could have been fatal. But Rome was not finished with Jesus, not even close. After the scourging, the soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium, the governor's official headquarters, and gathered the entire cohort around him. A Roman cohort was roughly 600 soldiers, so somewhere between 200 and 600 men assembled to participate in what came next, and what followed was a form of psychological and physical torture specifically designed to humiliate. They stripped Jesus and placed a scarlet or purple robe across his shredded back. The fabric pressing against open wounds would have caused searing pain with every movement. Then they twisted together a crown made of thorns and pressed it down onto his head. The thorns likely came from a plant called Ziziphus spina Christi, which grows throughout the Middle East and has rigid spines that can reach up to 2 inches long. These were not decorative pricks. They were hardened needle-like projections driven into the scalp, which is one of the most vascular areas on the human body. Blood would have poured down his face and into his eyes almost immediately. They placed a reed in his right hand as a mock scepter. Then they knelt before him one by one and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." But the mockery did not stay verbal for long. They spat on him. They took the reed from his hand and struck him across the head with it repeatedly. Every blow drove the thorns deeper into his scalp, compounding the bleeding and the pain. This was a Roman practice scholars sometimes compare to a mock triumph. When a Roman general won a great military victory, he would be paraded through the streets wearing a purple robe and a crown of laurel leaves. The soldiers took that honoured image and inverted it completely. They dressed Jesus as a king, but only to degrade him. Every element was carefully chosen: the robe, the crown, the scepter, the kneeling, the acclamation. All of it was designed to communicate a single message: you are nothing. You claimed to be a king, and look at you now. The psychological dimension of this should not be underestimated. Rome understood that destroying a person's dignity could be just as effective as destroying their body. The mockery was not a random act of cruelty by bored soldiers. It was a deliberate ritual of dehumanization carried out in front of hundreds of witnesses. And for Jesus, it was only the middle point of the ordeal. Because the cross was still waiting, crucifixion was Rome's masterpiece of cruelty. It was reserved for the lowest classes of society: slaves, pirates, enemies of the state, and those convicted of the most serious offences. Roman citizens were almost never crucified. It was considered too degrading even to discuss in polite company. The Roman orator Cicero called it the most cruel and disgusting penalty, and said the very word cross should be kept far away from not only the bodies of Roman citizens, but from their thoughts, their eyes, and their ears. Even speaking about crucifixion in front of a Roman citizen was considered offensive. So when Rome crucified someone, the message was total: you are beneath us. You are less than human, and your death will be as slow, as painful, and as public as we can possibly make it. After the scourging and the mockery, Jesus was forced to carry the horizontal beam of his cross through the streets of Jerusalem to the execution site at Golgotha. This beam was called the patibulum, and it typically weighed between 75 and 125 pounds. The victim would carry it across the back of the shoulders, with the arms draped over, and sometimes tied to it. Given that Jesus had been awake all night, beaten during his trial before the Sanhedrin, scourged to the point of severe blood loss, and crowned with thorns that were still embedded in his scalp, the fact that he collapsed under the weight should surprise no one. The soldiers pressed a bystander named Simon of Cyrene into service to carry the beam the rest of the way. At Golgotha, Jesus was laid on the crossbeam and nails were driven through his wrists, not through the palms as most artwork depicts. The Greek word used in the Gospels for hand can refer to the entire area from the wrist to the fingertips, and anatomically a nail through the center of the palm cannot support the weight of a hanging body. The soft tissue between the metacarpal bones would tear through under stress. The nails, typically 5 to 7 inches long and about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, were driven through the space between the radius and ulnar bones near the wrist or through the carpal tunnel area. This would have crushed or severed the median nerve, sending catastrophic waves of burning pain up both arms. The pain was so distinctive and so extreme that a new word was eventually invented to describe it: excruciating, from the Latin excruciatus, meaning out of the cross. The very concept of the worst possible pain originates from this execution method. The crossbeam was then hoisted up and attached to the vertical post called the stipes, which was already fixed in the ground. Jesus' feet were nailed to the stipes, likely with a single large nail driven through both heels or through the tops of the feet, with the knees bent to the side. In 1968, archaeologists excavating a tomb in Jerusalem discovered the heel bone of a crucified man named Jehohanan. The nail was still embedded in the bone, and a small wooden plaque was still attached beneath the nail head. This provided the first direct physical evidence confirming how Roman crucifixion nails were actually used and positioned. Once the victim was suspended, the slow process of dying began, and it could last anywhere from several hours to several days depending on the severity of the prior scourging, the weather, and the physical condition of the victim. The primary cause of death in crucifixion was not blood loss from the nail wounds. It was asphyxiation combined with hypovolemic shock, dehydration, and cardiac stress. Here is how the mechanics worked. When the body hung from the arms, the weight pulled the chest cavity into a position of permanent inhalation. The intercostal muscles and the diaphragm were stretched to the point where exhaling became nearly impossible. To push the air out of the lungs, the victim had to press down on the nail through the feet and push the body upward, straightening the legs enough to relieve the downward pull on the chest. This would allow one breath, but the motion was excruciating because it meant scraping the shredded flesh of the back against the rough wood of the cross while simultaneously driving the full body weight through the nail in the feet. So every single breath became a conscious decision to endure another wave of agony. Inhale, sag down, suffocate, push up through the nails, exhale again and again for hours. Over time, the muscles became exhausted. The victim grew less and less able to push up. Shallow breathing led to a buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood, causing a condition called respiratory acidosis. The heart labored under increasing strain. Fluid began to collect around the lungs and the heart, and eventually the person simply could not lift themselves anymore. They suffocated. If the Romans wanted to accelerate the process, they would break the victim's legs with a heavy iron club. This practice was called Crucifixion. Without functioning legs, the victim could no longer push up to breathe and would die within minutes. The Gospel of John records that the soldiers broke the legs of the two men crucified alongside Jesus. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. So instead, a soldier drove a spear into his side, and blood and water flowed out. Medical experts believe this detail indicates a rupture of the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, which would have filled with fluid during the prolonged cardiovascular stress of crucifixion. The plasma would have separated from the red blood cells, producing the appearance of blood and water described by John. Jesus hung on that cross for approximately 6 hours, from about 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. The method that killed him was engineered over centuries to maximize suffering, public shame, and spectacle. It was Rome's ultimate statement of dominance, and it was used on the man who claimed to be the Son of God. But Jesus was not the first biblical figure to face Roman violence. Before the cross, there was a sword, and before Jesus began his public ministry, one of the most important prophets in Scripture had already been killed. John the Baptist was the forerunner of Jesus, a prophet who lived in the Judean wilderness, ate locusts and wild honey, and called people to repent and be baptized. He was bold, confrontational, uncompromising. He told the religious leaders of his day that they were a brood of vipers. He told soldiers to stop extorting people. He told tax collectors to take only what was required. And he told Herod Antipas, the Roman-appointed tetrarch of Galilee, that his marriage to Herodias was unlawful. Herodias had been married to Herod's brother Philip. By taking her as his own wife, Herod violated Jewish law, and John said so publicly. Repeatedly, Herod arrested John and threw him in prison. But the Gospel of Mark tells us something remarkable. Herod actually feared John. He recognized that John was righteous and holy. He even enjoyed listening to him speak. But Herodias wanted John dead, and she was willing to wait for the right moment. That moment came at Herod's birthday banquet. Herodias' daughter, traditionally identified as Salome, danced for Herod and his guests. Herod was so delighted that he made a reckless oath in front of everyone. He promised the girl anything she wanted, up to half his kingdom. At her mother's instruction, the girl asked for the head of John the Baptist. On a platter, Herod was distressed, but he had made the promise publicly, and to retract it would mean losing face in front of the most powerful men in his territory. So he sent an executioner to the prison. The soldier beheaded John and brought the head on a platter. It was given to the girl gave it to her mother. Beheading was considered one of the more merciful forms of Roman execution. A skilled executioner could sever the head with 1 or 2 strikes of a heavy sword, but the speed of the death did not make the practice humane. The victim was typically forced to kneel, sometimes with their hands bound behind them, and extend their neck. The crowd would watch. The severed head was often displayed afterward as a public warning, or in this case, as a prize at a dinner party. For John, there was no formal trial, no charges under Roman law, no appeal. The greatest prophet born of women, as Jesus himself would later call him, was killed because a teenage girl danced and a weak man refused to break his promise. His ministry ended not on a battlefield or in a courtroom, but in a prison cell, at the bottom of a political calculation between a vindictive woman and a cowardly king. But as the early church grew after the death and resurrection of Jesus, Roman violence against biblical figures only intensified, and the apostles who carried the message forward paid for it with their bodies. In the city of Philippi, Paul and Silas encountered a slave girl possessed by a spirit that enabled her to predict the future. Her owners profited from her abilities, effectively running a fortune-telling business on the back of a tormented girl. Paul cast out the spirit. The girl was freed, but her owners were furious because their source of income vanished overnight. So they dragged Paul and Silas before the city magistrates and accused them of throwing the city into an uproar and advocating customs that were unlawful for Romans to practice. The crowd joined in the attack, and the magistrates, without conducting a trial or hearing a defense, ordered Paul and Silas to be stripped and beaten with rods. This punishment was known formally as fustigatio or verberatio, depending on its severity and context. It was carried out by lictors, Roman officers who served as enforcers and bodyguards for the magistrates. Each lictor carried a fasces, a bundle of wooden rods bound together with leather straps, and sometimes containing an axe head. The rods were used for public beatings. The axe represented the authority over life and death. The victim was stripped completely naked in public, which was itself a deliberate act of humiliation in the ancient world. Then the lictors would begin striking the victim with the wooden rods across the back, shoulders, and legs. Unlike scourging, which used metal and bone fragments to tear flesh, rod beatings focused on blunt force trauma. The strikes would bruise deep into the tissue, crack ribs, cause severe internal swelling, and rupture blood vessels beneath the skin. Prolonged beatings could cause kidney damage, internal bleeding, and in the most extreme cases, death. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians that he was beaten with rods on 3 separate occasions during his ministry. This was not a singular nightmare for him. It was a recurring cost of his work. But what makes the Philippi incident particularly striking is what happened afterward. After the beating, Paul and Silas were dragged into the innermost cell of the prison, and their feet were locked in stocks. They sat there in the dark, bruised and bleeding, unable to move their legs. And according to the book of Acts, at about midnight they began praying and singing hymns to God. Not quietly, the other prisoners were listening. Then an earthquake hit. The foundations of the prison shook. Every door flew open. Every chain came loose. The jailer woke up, saw the doors standing open, and assumed the prisoners had escaped. Under Roman law, a guard who lost his prisoners could be executed in their place. So the jailer drew his sword to kill himself. But Paul shouted from the darkness, "Do not harm yourself. We are all here." That night, the jailer fell on his knees and asked what he must do to be saved. He and his entire household were baptized before dawn. The next morning, the magistrates sent officers to release Paul and Silas, but Paul refused to leave quietly. He revealed that both he and Silas were Roman citizens. Beating a Roman citizen without a trial was a serious crime that could end the careers of the magistrates who ordered it. They were terrified. They came personally to apologize and escort Paul and Silas out of the city. This detail matters because it shows that Rome's own legal protections were routinely violated when it came to followers of Jesus. The system that was supposed to guarantee due process was often the very system that brutalized them. The law existed, but when the crowd was angry enough, the law could be conveniently forgotten. Of course, surviving a beating only to be thrown into a Roman prison was not exactly freedom, and Roman imprisonment was its own form of torture. Roman prisons were not designed for rehabilitation or reform. They were holding cells for people awaiting trial, execution, or further punishment, and the conditions inside were deliberately miserable. The most infamous Roman prison associated with biblical figures is the Mamertine prison in Rome, also known as the Tullianum. Tradition holds that both Peter and Paul were held in this prison before their respective executions. The structure still exists today beneath the church of San Giuseppe dei Falegnami near the Roman Forum. It consists of 2 chambers stacked vertically. The upper cell was grim enough, but the lower chamber, the Tullianum, was something else entirely. It was a small dungeon carved out of solid rock beneath street level. There were no windows, no ventilation to speak of. The only entrance to the lower cell was a hole in the floor of the upper chamber through which prisoners were dropped or lowered. Prisoners in the Tullianum sat in near total darkness on cold stone. The air was dense and foul. Sewage from the streets above sometimes seeped through the rock into the cell. Rats and insects were constant companions. Many prisoners were chained to the walls or to each other, making it impossible to move more than a few inches. Starvation was common because feeding prisoners was considered a low priority. Disease spread easily in the cramped, filthy conditions. Some prisoners died of illness or exposure before they ever saw a courtroom. Paul spent significant time in Roman custody at various points in his ministry. His first imprisonment in Rome, described at the end of the book of Acts, was a form of house arrest. He was permitted to live in rented quarters with a soldier guarding him and could receive visitors and continue teaching. But his second imprisonment, referenced in his second letter to Timothy, was very different. The tone of the letter tells you everything. Paul writes from what appears to be a traditional Roman dungeon. He is cold. He asks Timothy to bring his cloak and his scrolls. He is lonely. He writes that Demas abandoned him because he loved the present world. Most of his companions have gone to other cities or left him for other reasons. He knows with certainty that he is about to die. His words in 2 Timothy 4 are among the most moving in the New Testament. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. These words were not composed at a writing desk in a warm study. They were written in a Roman dungeon by a man sitting in chains who knew the executioner was coming. Peter also endured Roman imprisonment. In Acts 12, King Herod Agrippa arrested Peter and placed him under extreme security. 4 squads of 4 soldiers each were assigned to watch him. Peter was chained between 2 soldiers, while 2 more stood guard at the entrance. The level of security was extraordinary because Peter had slipped out of custody before. But according to Acts, the night before Peter's scheduled trial, an angel appeared in the cell. A light filled the room. The chains fell off Peter's wrists, and he walked out past the sleeping guards into the street. He knocked on the door of a house where believers were gathered and praying for him. When a servant girl answered and recognized his voice, she was so overjoyed she forgot to open the door and ran back to tell the others. They told her she was out of her mind, but Peter's miraculous escape was a temporary reprieve. Tradition tells us that he would eventually return to Rome and face a death far worse than anything the prison had offered. According to early church tradition, recorded most notably by Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century and later referenced by the historian Eusebius, Peter was crucified in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero, but Peter reportedly made one specific request. He asked to be crucified upside down. His reason was simple and devastating. He did not consider himself worthy to die in the same way as his Lord. The Romans granted the request. Whether out of contempt, amusement, or indifference, they turned the cross over and nailed Peter to it, with his head pointing toward the ground. Inverted crucifixion was even more torturous than the standard method. When a person is suspended upside down, blood rushes rapidly to the head. The intracranial pressure increases dramatically within minutes. The victim would experience an intense pounding headache, almost immediately followed by swelling of the face and pressure behind the eyes. Blood vessels in the head, neck, and brain would engorge under the unnatural volume of blood being pulled downward by gravity. Vision would blur, thinking would become confused, disorientation would intensify with every passing minute. But the victim would not die quickly from this alone. The human body is surprisingly resilient even in grotesque positions. The person would likely remain conscious for an extended period, fully and horrifyingly aware of their situation. Breathing would become increasingly labored as the weight of the abdominal organs pressed downward against the diaphragm from above. But unlike standard crucifixion, where the victim could push up on the footnails to steal a breath, an inverted victim had no such relief mechanism. Death would come from a combination of asphyxiation, cerebral hemorrhage, and cardiovascular collapse as the heart struggled to pump blood against gravity, with the entire circulatory system working in reverse. Estimates suggest this process could take several hours. Peter, the fisherman from Galilee who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had denied knowing him 3 times on the night of his arrest, and then been restored 3 times beside the Sea of Tiberias, who had preached on the day of Pentecost and watched 3,000 people come to faith in a single afternoon, died hanging upside down on a Roman cross in the imperial capital, because he believed he was unworthy to share the same death as his master. Paul's execution stands in stark contrast to Peter's. Because Paul held Roman citizenship, he was legally entitled to a different form of death. Roman law prohibited the crucifixion of its own citizens regardless of their crime. So when Paul was finally condemned, he was sentenced to die by the sword rather than the cross. Tradition holds that Paul was led out of the city to a place along the Ostian Way, the road leading south from Rome toward the port of Ostia. He would have been escorted by a small detail of soldiers. At the execution site, he was likely forced to kneel and extend his neck. A Roman executioner, trained and experienced, drew a gladius, the short sword used by the Roman military. With a single stroke, the apostle who had written more of the New Testament than any other individual was dead. Beheading was officially considered a privilege under Roman law. It was fast, it was relatively clean, and it spared the citizen the prolonged public degradation of the cross. But the fact that a quicker death was classified as a privilege reveals the warped moral universe Rome operated within. The best mercy the empire could extend to its own people was simply a faster way to die. Paul had experienced nearly every other form of Roman violence before that final blow. He had been beaten with rods 3 times, shipwrecked 3 times, stoned once at Lystra, and left for dead outside the city gates. He had been imprisoned repeatedly. He had gone without food, without sleep, and without shelter. He had been betrayed by people he trusted and opposed by people he was trying to serve, but he never stopped. In his final letter, written from the Mamertine dungeon, he told Timothy not to be ashamed of the gospel and not to be afraid of suffering, because the God who called them into this work was faithful. And then Paul walked out to the execution site and laid down his neck. According to later Christian tradition, when Paul's severed head hit the ground, it bounced 3 times, and at each spot where it touched, a spring of water erupted from the earth. This is almost certainly legend. But the fact that early Christians told this story reveals how they understood his death. They did not remember it as a defeat. They remembered it as a planting, something powerful going into the ground that would bring life for centuries to come. Of all the original 12 apostles, tradition tells us that John was the only one who died of natural causes. But that does not mean Rome left him untouched. According to the early church father Tertullian, writing around 200 AD, the apostle John was arrested and brought to Rome during the reign of Emperor Domitian. There, at a site near the Latin Gate, he was plunged into a large cauldron of boiling oil. The punishment was clearly intended to kill him. Execution by boiling was an extreme method occasionally employed by Rome and other ancient powers. The victim would be forced into a vessel of oil or water heated over an open fire. The agony was beyond description. The skin would blister, crack, and peel almost on contact. Subcutaneous fat would begin to render. Internal organs would cook. Death usually came from severe burns, shock, or catastrophic organ failure, but not always quickly. But according to the tradition, John emerged from the boiling oil unharmed. He was not burned. He was not killed. He was not even visibly injured. The Romans, apparently stunned by what they had witnessed and unable to execute a man that boiling oil could not destroy, chose a different response. They exiled John to the island of Patmos, a small barren rock in the Aegean Sea that Rome used as a penal colony. Patmos was isolated, harsh, windswept. Exiled prisoners were sometimes forced into labour in quarries or mines. Food and fresh water were scarce. Shelter was minimal. The island was essentially a slow death sentence, dressed up to look like clemency. But here is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. It was on Patmos, in exile, cut off from the churches he had spent his life building, that John received the revelation. The apocalyptic visions that form the final book of the Bible were given to a man that boiling oil could not kill and empire could not silence. And what he saw on that desolate island was not despair. He saw the risen Jesus standing in glory among the churches. He saw the defeat of evil. He saw the fall of every empire that opposed God. He saw a new heaven and a new earth where there would be no more tears, no more pain, and no more death. John wrote all of it down and sent it to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. The words of a prisoner on a rock in the middle of the sea became the closing chapter of sacred scripture. But the persecution of biblical figures was not limited to individual apostles. As Rome's hostility toward Christians escalated, entire communities of believers faced collective punishments of unimaginable cruelty. 2 methods in particular deserve attention, because they represent the outer boundary of what Rome was willing to do to the followers of Jesus. The first was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This practice involved throwing unarmed condemned prisoners into an arena to be attacked and torn apart by wild animals in front of a cheering crowd. Lions, bears, leopards, bulls, and wild boars were all used depending on what was available. The spectacle was staged as public entertainment during the Ludi, the great games held in Roman amphitheatres. Tens of thousands of spectators would pack the stands to watch. The condemned were given no weapons, no armour, no protection of any kind. They were simply released onto the sand and the animals were let loose. Paul himself may have experienced some version of this. In 1 Corinthians 15, he writes that he fought with beasts at Ephesus. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Paul is speaking literally or metaphorically. If he meant it literally, then it means Paul was thrown into an arena with wild animals and somehow survived. If he was speaking figuratively, then he was comparing the ferocity of his human opponents to wild beasts. Either reading confirms the same point. This method of execution was well known in the world he inhabited, and Christians were increasingly among its victims. The most devastating wave of persecution using this and other methods came under Emperor Nero, following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire raged for 6 days and destroyed roughly 70% of the city. Suspicion quickly turned toward Nero himself. Rumors spread that he had ordered the fire so he could rebuild Rome according to his own grand vision. To deflect blame and quiet the accusations, Nero needed a scapegoat. He chose the Christians. The Roman historian Tacitus, who was no friend of Christianity, records what happened next. Christians were arrested in large numbers. Some were sewn into the skins of wild animals and then thrown to dogs that mauled them to death in the arena. The crowd would watch as the condemned, unable to shed the animal hides and unable to defend themselves, were torn apart by trained hunting dogs, while the spectators cheered. But Nero took the brutality even further with a method that shocked even his contemporaries. Tacitus describes how Nero had Christians arrested, coated in pitch and wax, tied to tall wooden stakes, and set on fire after nightfall to serve as human torches illuminating his garden parties. These men and women burned alive along the pathways and garden walks, while Nero entertained his guests. He would sometimes dress as a charioteer and ride among the dying, racing his chariot through the gardens while the bodies of believers smouldered on either side. The cruelty is almost beyond comprehension. These were men and women whose only crime was refusing to worship Caesar and insisting that Jesus of Nazareth was Lord. They were not revolutionaries. They were not plotting against the state. They were tent makers, servants, merchants, mothers, and fathers. They shared meals together and worshipped in homes, and for that they were turned into fuel for the entertainment of a tyrant. The book of Hebrews, likely written during or shortly after this era of persecution, contains a passage in chapter 11 that may reference these very events. The writer speaks of unnamed heroes of faith who were tortured, mocked, whipped, chained, imprisoned, stoned, sawn in two, and killed with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. And then this stunning verdict: the world was not worthy of them. Peter himself wrote to persecuted believers during this period. In his first letter, he tells them not to be surprised at the fiery ordeal they are experiencing, as though something strange were happening to them. Instead, he tells them to rejoice insofar as they share in Christ's sufferings, so that when his glory is revealed, they may also rejoice and be glad. Those words were not abstract theological encouragement offered from a safe distance. They were written to people who had watched friends and neighbours burned alive, who sat in hiding wondering if they would be next. Who knew that the empire considered their very existence a crime, and yet they held on. They did not recant. They did not disappear. Somehow, against every odd, the movement grew. This is what makes the story of Roman torture and biblical figures so extraordinary. Rome designed these methods to end movements, to crush rebellion before it could spread, to make the cost of defiance so horrific that no reasonable person would choose it. And by every historical standard, these methods should have worked. They had worked against countless other groups and movements throughout Roman history. Break the leaders, destroy the bodies, display the remains, and the followers scatter. But that is not what happened here. Jesus was scourged, mocked, and crucified. And within weeks his followers were proclaiming that he had risen from the dead and refusing to stop even when threatened with the same fate. Peter was thrown in prison and escaped. He was eventually crucified upside down, and the church he helped build only grew larger. Paul was beaten, stoned, shipwrecked, imprisoned, and finally beheaded. But his letters, written from prison cells and borrowed rooms, became the theological backbone of a religion that would outlast the empire that killed him. John was boiled in oil and exiled to a barren island, and from that island he wrote visions of a future that billions of people still believe in today. Unnamed Christians were fed to dogs, burned as torches, and thrown to animals in arenas. Yet within 3 centuries, the faith they died for became the official religion of the very empire that tried to destroy it. Rome used torture to send a message: submit or suffer. But the people who endured that torture sent a different message back, one that proved more durable than any empire. It is easy to read the Bible as a collection of ancient stories, distant and safe. theological abstractions. But when you understand what these people actually went through, the words on the page change. They gain weight. They gain urgency. They gain blood. When Paul writes, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain," he is not being poetic. He is sitting in a cell. He knows the sword is coming, and he means every word. When Peter writes about sharing in Christ's sufferings, he is not speaking from a comfortable study. He is writing to people whose neighbours have been lit on fire, and he himself will soon hang upside down on a cross because he could not bear the thought of dying the same way his Lord did. When John writes about a future where God will wipe every tear from their eyes and death shall be no more, he is writing from a barren rock in the Aegean Sea, where he was sent after boiling oil could not kill him. His hope is not wishful thinking. It is the defiant, unshakable confidence of a man who has already faced the absolute worst that the most powerful empire on earth could throw at him, and he is still standing, still writing, still believing. Rome fell. The crosses rotted. The arenas crumbled into ruins that tourists photograph today. The garden torches went dark almost 2,000 years ago. The emperors who ordered these tortures are remembered mostly for their cruelty and madness. But the words that these tortured men and women left behind are still being read, still being translated into new languages, still being whispered in prisons and shouted in cathedrals, still comforting the grieving and challenging the comfortable, still changing lives in every nation on the planet. Rome built an empire on fear. These people built something on faith. And 2,000 years later, it is painfully obvious which one survived.